Hey everyone, welcome back to Reed Makes. In this video, I'm going to be using this Star Wars Legion set for a speeder chase scene through a desert landscape. These sets are normally used for a tabletop game, but I'm going to be repurposing them for this diorama. These sets are quite cool as they come with different heads and poses. And now please enjoy this satisfying montage of me cutting the sprues. After I finish cutting the screws, I then use my X-Acto knife to cut off the mold lines. And then I began gluing both the speeders and the bikers together. These sets are quite satisfying to build as most of the pieces snap on quite nicely. After I finished assembling the first speeder, I then moved on to the second. And with both speeders done, I could move on to the miniatures. From the head selection, I found that this Togruta guy looked pretty cool. I also gave him the arm with the blaster pistol. The other rider is going to have this spear. For his head, I went with the Deveronian, basically a Star Wars devil-like race. After I finished assembling the miniatures and speeders, I moved on to the base. Again, I started with the picture frame and disassembled it for the base of the diorama. I cut out some pieces of foam board to the exact dimensions of the frame to create the surface. I glued the sheet on top of the frame and began the painstaking process of removing this paper layer. I'm pretty sure there are some brands of foam core that don't do this, but I chose the wrong one this time. I added some more pieces of foam core on top of this to create some dunes. I beveled the edges of each of these strips to create the dunes for the sand. And once that was done, I mixed together some plaster, paint, and Mod Podge with a little bit of water to create the texture paste. I then spread it over the surface and then pushed it around with a paintbrush and then my finger. For the layout of the diorama, I wanted to do some sort of sandstorm blowing in the back and a rocky section along the side. I created the backdrop for the sandstorm with pieces of foam core kind of leaned against these triangle wedges. I glued it to the base and then I cut off the excess on each side. For the rock section, I used some pieces of XPS foam that I built up in layers. I used a bigger utility knife to carve out a rocky surface. And then I added some texture paste onto the rock as well. After the texture paste dried, I added some glue onto the base for the sand. I sprinkled the sand all over the base and then sealed it with some isopropyl alcohol. I then added some larger rocks against the cliff in the back, and then sealed off the entire surface with some black paint. After the black primer dried, I then moved on to using my airbrush. I began with a dark brown and then moved up in lighter colors as I went along. After I was done painting the sand, I then went back to the rock, adding some more orange. I also scraped these dry pastels to create some pigment powders for a dusty surface. I also added some onto the rock as well. For some foliage, I'm using these Army Painter tufts of grass. I sporadically added a few here and there all over the cliffside. The final section of the terrain is the SandStorm. I first added some PVA glue against the backdrop and then added some cotton balls. I first sort of stretched and pulled the cotton balls to give them more fluffy texture, and then I added them onto the diorama. Once the glue had dried, I then used my airbrush to create the SandStorm effect. First, I sprayed kind of overhead with a lighter tan color, and then after that, I moved to spraying with a darker brown from underneath. And with that, the terrain was finished, and I could move on to painting the miniatures. I liked the paint schemes from the box art, so I kind of went with something similar to those. I took the speeders and the miniatures outside and primed them with a black and then sprayed them with a white from above. This trick creates a highlight from the top section and the shadows underneath. I painted the first speeder with a tan. It took me a few coats till I was able to build it up to the color I wanted. I painted the seat a leathery brown, and I painted the rest of the metal parts with a black. I felt like the bike was a little bland, so I added the red markings along the back panel. The last few things I wanted to do was to add these silver highlights, and then add some black grime with this sponge. And this was the final look. For the first miniature, I painted his pants and gloves black, and then I painted his holster and his bandolier brown. Deveronians have red skin, so I painted the head red. I painted his shirt a lighter brown, and I painted the pauldron blue. And with that, I can remove this miniature from the base and add him to his speeder bike. The second speeder got a similar paint job, except all of the panels are a darker brown. The seat was painted with a lighter tan, and all the metal bits were painted black. And then for some final details, I added some silver highlights and some black grime using a sponge. The last thing to paint was the other miniature. I painted his head orange and added some white markings. I painted the lenses of his goggles with a blue, and then I painted his shirt with sort of an olive drab browny green color. I painted his pants a reddish brown, and then I painted his blaster, gauntlets, and boots with a black. The rest of his armor pieces I painted with a leather brown. After I had all the colors on, I went back and added a wash off camera to darken the whole figure and blend all the colors together. And this was the final look. I then removed this miniature off of its base and added it onto the speeder. With the miniature painting done, I then moved on to drill a hole in the side of the diorama for the switch for the lighting. I stuck down the miniatures onto the base, and I ran some tiny wires to this 3-volt LED. I find the best way to glue these lights on is with some UV resin. I stuck this miniature onto the base, and then I painted the sides of the diorama black. And with that, this diorama is done. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you like what you saw here, please consider watching my previous video where I make a bounty hunter showdown on a snow planet.